we are going to welcome our friend Barry Rowan. I won't go through all of Barry's many accomplishments. He's been a leader in different businesses over time, a CFO, as well as a CEO or president of businesses. Many of you know him as a mentor. He's mentored an incredible number of young people, especially Christian mentorship. He helps serve now on the board of the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship and the Alumni Association here, and he has a book coming out. His first book, which we're going to talk about. And as an author, I know the number one thing you can do for an author is shill their book. They love it. So September, The Spiritual Art of Business, Connecting the Daily with the Divine. I actually read a pre-release copy. It's extraordinary. You should order at least 10 copies right now on Amazon where it's available. And even if you don't read it, order a copy and write a 5-star review. I can say that for Barry. So Barry, thank you for joining us today.
I know my wife bought one, so you can double the sales, pretty easily.
Barry, I want to dive right in. I mean, we've been talking a lot in this panel about how faith is expressed in work. And I know that's not an academic topic for you, is it? It's quite personal.
It's very personal. I mean, you've heard stories from the panel about how, particularly like Andy and Scott came to faith in 6 months before they were here. I was not a member of the Christian Fellowship when I was here, but I'd gone to church my whole life. And I really came to a surrendered faith out of a crisis of meaning and work. And that's why this is just so important to me. So it's not academic at all.
Say more about that, the crisis of meaning and work.
Well, so I came out of HBS. I had 5 offers. I took the lowest paying offer. I'm sort of a math guy, but I had a little trouble.
You didn't learn a lot at HBS.
No, apparently not. It was all about building equity, though. And so I joined a startup company, and I graduated back in the Paleozoic era, actually the same year as Andy, in 1983. And so I joined a startup company. It grew really fast. Went from 8 employees, and we got up to a couple hundred employees. But I just came to this point of saying, why? And I was invited up to this camp. We were living in Colorado on a Young Life camp and looking out over this beautiful Arkansas River Valley and just started weeping. And what really struck me was the juxtaposition of the serenity of that environment was in such contrast to this turmoil within me. And I said, I am not willing to go on living a divided life. I mean, I wasn't suicidal. I just said, I've got to figure out the answer to these questions. And so that was the beginning of the journey. And I didn't know if God was even part of the question, but I quit going to church because I thought it was hypocritical to go to a church and worship a God I no longer believed in. And God had to take me down to bedrock. And then I decided, as the lawyers would say, and I know we have a few in here, based on the preponderance of the evidence, I think it's more likely that God exists than he doesn't. And I'm going to put all my chips on that square because I think that's the case. But it's still, and then it was, what about Jesus? And C.S. Lewis says, I concluded he's either who he says he is or he's a raging lunatic, right? And so I said, are you going to live your life for God or for yourself? And so my coming to faith was out of an act of surrender. When Jesus said, any of you does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. And those words just penetrated me. And so I came into the kingdom with heel marks in the sand is the best way to say it, as I basically said, I give up. So.
That's right. He's the hound of heaven. He's a pretty persistent guy. But it sounds like, your surrender to Jesus helped you answer a lot of questions about purpose, both in life and at work. And you were able to now make new connections about meaning in work. Am I hearing that properly? Maybe say more.
I mean, it was, God in his wisdom, before we could answer the question of meaning in work and purpose in work, had to show me purpose in life. So that's why I think he had to take me down to bedrock, is are you going to live your life for God or yourself? And the fundamental mistake I was making was I was trying to fit God into my plans instead of being willing to submit to his plan. Yeah. And once I began to realize that he has a plan and a point of view, I could see that living for Jesus was the purpose in life, but it still did not answer the question of meaning in work. And I spent the next 8 years, as my wife can attest, we've been married 41 years and moved 15 times, so we've had this great sense of adventure. But I wrote 350 pages to myself in a journal over the next 8 years, just trying to understand and make sense of this. And God had to just take me through what I would describe as a succession of paradigm shifts. I was just thinking about work all wrong.
What did, since you mentioned Linda, and I know Linda's a remarkable person, what role did Linda play in that journey for you? Because I know how important your relationship is to you.
Well, a huge part of it was prayer. I mean, and so I remember coming on a trip to Boston, and right before I was going to submit my life to Christ, and she could just feel the tension in the house, and so she was just faithful in that, and then just a partnership in the conversation. But to a point, I realized that one of the mistakes I made early on was I was buying 2 tickets to the roller coaster instead of just one. I let her come along with me, and it really wasn't fair to her to have her go all the ups and all the downs. So I got a little more judicious about when to bring her into the carnival ride. So.
Yeah, and maybe dig in a little bit more just about how that knowledge of Jesus, how the journey that you went on began to filter into the way that you acted at work or the way in which you conducted your work with others.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental mistake I was making in these paradigm shifts was I was thinking about life from the outside in instead of the inside out. I thought, if I just get the right job, somehow I'll be filled up and that'll solve it. And the corollary to that was I was trying to derive meaning from my work instead of bringing meaning to my work. And the test was, if I have somebody working with me who say they're doing a formula in an Excel spreadsheet, this is going to sound crazy, and they're working on a strategic plan, how do I connect the dots between them doing this Excel formula and my purpose in life? And that literally was the test for me. How can I make a connection every moment of every day? And as the panel talked about, there's intrinsic value in our work when we do that. And so there's no so that to why we work. I don't so that I work so that I can make a pile of money and give it away, or so that I can, quote, retire someday and then do something that matters. No, every moment of every day is embedded with God's will if we have the ears to listen to it, I think. And so that was a radical transformation. And then as I began to understand the purpose of work differently, I began to realize that my working job definition became contribute to a better society as seen through the eyes of God. And after years of wrestling, that kind of cemented for me. And then it was, well, what's the distinctive about business, and how does it contribute to society uniquely? And we talked about that, and the question in the back raised that. For me, there were 4 things. It's responsible value creation, serving customers, creating an environment that enables people to grow into the full expression of themselves, and being a good corporate citizen. We could unpack all of those, but when I began to see it in that context, I could now say, okay, here's the connection between that formula in an Excel spreadsheet. Is if you're trying to get that right so that you can have the business model be right, so the company can be more successful, so that it can fulfill literally its God-ordained purpose in the society, which are those things.
Barry, I love the way you phrase that. I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but you were trying to get purpose from your work, and it became about endowing your work with purpose or endowing it with meaning. If I'm
I was trying to drive meaning from the work, just get the right job, and it's really about bringing meaning to our work. I learned that, by the way, from a shuttle bus driver at an airport parking lot. This woman was, you've all been on these shuttles, right? And they're zombies. And who wouldn't be a zombie, right? Driving 8 hours, the same loop. And there was this woman driving that bus, and she was chatting it up with the customers, hopping up to take their luggage off. And it was one of those outlying parking lots where we cheapskates park, so I had a long time. And I was
a good CFO.
Yeah, that's right. Save a little money. And so I was the last cheapskate to get off the bus. And I said, could I ask you a question? And she said, sure, anything. I said, do you like your job? She said, I love my job. And I said, why do you like your job? She said, I meet interesting people going interesting places. Yeah. And I thought, if you can bring meaning to your work in that kind of a job, and I got on an airplane to Singapore after that, and I made this list of jobs, and I was the CFO of a public company at that time, about 35 years old, and we had about 2,500 employees. And I thought, okay, this is a big job, but in tears, I wrote big question marks because I could not answer the question of how I could bring meaning to my work in an authentic way, and it took 3 years later to get to some understanding of that.
That is awesome. I mean, ironically, I just wrote a book on purpose, and the opening introductory example is a school bus driver, actually, named Curtis Jenkins, who, that's a hard job. And he had transformed it into this opportunity to love kids, to mentor kids. And I love that example, how we all have the opportunity every day to kind of bring Jesus into our work, as we heard earlier from the panel, and a sense of purpose into work. I want to pick up on something because you've had a lot of accolades over the course of your career. Barry just retired March 10th, which is why his suntan is so good right now. He's tan rested and ready if you're looking for a board member, although he's going on a 4-week silent retreat after this, I think. Talk to me, though, about failure. We heard from Sheba about that. We heard from Andy and Scott to a lesser extent about that. Why is failure such an important part of your story?
Yeah, and when we were thinking about what might be helpful here, we thought we should talk about failure. Achievement pours out of the water fountains in this place, and we rarely talk about failure. So I just credit Sheba and the team for doing that. And so I've been part of building 8 businesses over 40 years, and 8 businesses over 40 years. 6 were successful, 2 were not. One, they were very successful. One we sold for $10 billion, and so it was successful. But I talk much more about the failures, and the reason is that God is in the midst of our pain, and our faith and walking with Jesus gives us reason to embrace the pain. And to the question about what do you do when you get into the darkness, my experience has been to make the black blacker than black. And our temptation is to skirt around the edges. And for me, my career has been the crucible for the formation of my soul. I have grown more through my career than any other aspect of my life. And the biggest failure of my life came, I was joined a large-scale startup in 1999 in the telecom business. So you kind of know how it ends if you remember the telecom business. So we had this large-scale startup in Brazil. We won the license to compete with the incumbent phone company there. I initially was the CFO. We raised $2.5 billion. We hired 4,000 people in 2 years because the way we won the license was to commit to build out service in 80 cities in 2 years. So it was this massive startup. It took off like a rocket. The stock price tripled in the first year. We put on 500,000 customers in the first 10 months. It was the fastest growing competitive CLEC in the world. And then we saw some cracks show up in the operations. And so the shareholders recruited me to be the CEO, moved to Brazil. And Linda's only requirement was I have a bodyguard and a bulletproof car, and which I did. Marcio Bucheski, this big, 260-pound Brazilian. But when I got there, it was way worse than we thought. Ultimately, 200,000 of the 500,000 customers couldn't pay their bills. The capital markets crashed, and our partner decided not to fund their next tranche of capital, which we thought they would do. They were within their rights not to, but it was $100 million. I learned 4 very important words after that: fully funded business plan. Do not go into a hole and go in with a hole in your. So I moved there, and I'll give you the short version. We had to lay off 1,500 of the 4,000 people to save 2,500 jobs. Wow. And every time I drove into the parking lot with Marcio Bucheski, I felt like I wanted to throw up. It was just, I didn't speak Portuguese. I was here, and it was just extraordinarily painful. But out of that, I just paint that somewhat graphic picture for you to say that I grew more spiritually through that experience than any part of my life. The business failure, and we ultimately raised another $250 million and sold the company to one of our partners, but people got a fraction of their money back, including us, because we'd made a lot of investment in that, because I believed in it, and I thought it was ethically important for us to invest as a family if we were raising this money. But out of that, it was the first time it ever really failed at anything of any scale. God showed me that I had made achievement my God. And it wasn't until the God went away that I realized a big part of the achievement went with it. And the business failure paled in comparison to the spiritual anguish that I went through. I can remember being on the beach outside of Rio, just reading Job over and over, and just, Lord, the very thing I hoped for, which was to die, you haven't granted me. I mean, because it'd be a whole lot more fun if I were not here right now. But he absolutely liberated me from that God of achievement. And then after that, I spent a year trying to buy businesses with 2 other people who were very talented. A senior partner in McKinsey, a guy who ran a 6,000-person operation. We made offers on 7 businesses because we wanted to buy them and own them and operate them on God's principles, and we didn't get any of them. Wow. And finally, one of the guys said, by the way, Rowan, this has been fun, but I need a job, so I'm going to go back to work. But out of that, God inverted my perspective of time. It's still, that's Jesus' words of, any of you who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple. They re-haunted me, and the question was, what is the next part of everything? And for me, it was, are you willing to live fully in the present moment and let me, God, unfold the pattern of your life as I see fit? And I said, no. And out of that, I finally said yes. And it completely changed the way I live my life. And Linda's like me both of, okay, now I live fully. I attempt to live fully in the present moment. I see his will and his word embedded in every moment of our lives if we have the eyes to look at it. And there's a deepening trust that he, in fact, cares about the talents he's given us more than we do ourselves, and that we find our significance in him. But it wouldn't have been without those failures that I think God would have deepened those understandings in me.
Wow, Barry, what a story. And I love that you used the phrase earlier that business had been a crucible for your soul, I think. You may have just made that up on the spot, but it was very good. Those turns of phrase have resulted in InterVarsity Press asking you to write a book, right, with parts of your story. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we love investing, as Lynn and I call it, in the next generation of Christ-following leaders who are called to live fully for God in the world. So, like you all are, in the world. Nothing wrong with being a pastor, but how do you live in the harshness of this world? And because I went through such a struggle with that, and as we talk to people around the country and the world, there's such a wrestling for this. So it's called The Spiritual Art of Business, Connecting the Daily with the Divine. It's 40 days of guided meditations. It is really an invitation to enter into a conversation with God. So they're very short chapters out of my own foibles that hopefully will help people ask the questions for themselves and develop their own perspective. Because this intimacy with God and this adventure of following Jesus is the greatest adventure this life has to offer.
Well, I will say, I got to read a pre-release version from InterVarsity, and it was extraordinary. I loved that it was 40 different chapters, almost like a 40-day path. We may have known someone who had a 40-day journey at some point in the Bible. And, one of the things that always strikes me is just how reflective you are, and that comes through in the book and just how you've crafted it. So I would really recommend it to others as well. I think it's a really positive experience that each of you could have, really meditative.
It's the real deal. It's very vulnerable. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
And by the way, I know somebody wanted John to ask a question before, but he is a very accomplished guy in his own right, and I can't let him get away without answering at least one question. So you have been through a change yourself, right? So you went from a very successful career at Invesco now to doing impact, faith-driven investing. Tell us a little bit about that transition and what was going to be going on. See, that was good.
That's a cold
I'm
call.
learning from Maggie. See, she delegated to Trey.
So I kind of in between what Sheba talked about probably, because I didn't transition to nonprofit, but I'd spent the majority of my career at large institutions. I had worked at McKinsey & Company for a while. I had worked at, while I was at HBS, I worked at a hedge fund called Bridgewater Associates. And then I spent about 9 years at Invesco, which is a pretty large investment management organization. And during COVID, I actually started to think about what was next. And I was writing a book called The HBR Guide to Crafting Your Purpose, about purpose in life and at work, and got really convicted that I probably wasn't living with as much purpose as I should at work. I really did. It doesn't hurt that now in talks about the book, I can say, like, I was so convicted by this book that I actually changed careers. You should buy it on Amazon. But
it is a great book, by the way. I've read it. So,
I did. I did switch, and I joined Sovereign's Capital. It was really not on my radar. I spent about 6 or 8 months trying to think about what was next. Sovereigns is an explicitly Christian investment firm, which seems like an odd thing to be, but we invest alongside Christian leaders, whether venture-backed startups, private equity-backed firms, public equity companies, folks like Scott in the public markets, et cetera, real estate. And at the time I joined, it was kind of a startup. It had been around for a while, but kind of a startup. It was obviously a big switch to be in an explicitly Christian environment or faith-driven environment. But it's really rejuvenated my career, I think, in that it was kind of a scary move, as Sheba said. It felt like a risk, although it really wasn't a risk in retrospect. And it's allowed me to lean into this idea of the integration of my faith and values into the work that I do, and have a real sense of purpose to really endow my work with meaning, as you said, on a more daily basis. So it's been a great switch for me. Thank you.
And for those of you who don't know John as well, he is one of the most high-capacity people you'll ever meet. They have 4 young kids, he and Jackie, and he's written 4 books now. And he not only writes books for the HBR Review, but he just wrote a novel called Miracles. And I don't know how, I read it, and I wrote a review of it, actually. See, I did give you the 5-star review. And wrote, yeah.
He did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was true. But I read the whole thing in 48 hours. It read like a gripper novel. And so anyway, I would recommend that. It was
We didn't really plan this at all. This is, oh, Barry, thank you for bringing this up. No, it is true. And it was fun to write. It's kind of a Christian novel, but hopefully accessible to other audiences. And look, I'm grateful for your support in that. Well, Barry, I know now we're going to wrap up, and you want to talk a little bit about the work that you all are doing through the Alumni Association, through the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, and then also bring up our friend Danelle. Is that right?
Yeah, I would like to just, before we bring Danelle up here, just frame this a little bit. So on the history of the HBS Christian Fellowship, how many people who are in the audience who are alums or even students were part of the HBS Christian Fellowship? Yeah, so we have a pretty good representation here. I was not, as I mentioned, and the Christian Fellowship has gone through quite a transition. In the 90s, and I know Steve Nelson is here with Eddie. Steve, you'll remember the Christian Fellowship got down to a total of one person at one point, correct? And as I recall it, you and Andy Wazenchuk and Jeff Barneson gathered to pray. And Brian, and yeah. Oh, and Brian, you too. So the four of you guys gathered to pray. So to give you just some sense of history, down to one person. And then it began to get more momentum. We had some great leaders in the early 2000s. Lynn and I got involved in 2008 or so, speaking, and they ended up taking 6 trips, 6 years in a row with Harvard graduate students to Central America. And it began to get more momentum. And then John was actually the early president of this. But honestly, the experience was quite uneven. So depending on the quality of the leaders, and so we did what you do at Harvard Business School. We commissioned a strategy study, right? So we actually hired somebody for the summer from the Kennedy School. He interviewed 30 people from the president of InterVarsity on down and lots of students. And 3 things came out of that I think have made an impact, and I'll tell you kind of where things are now. So one thing was one of the guys who was on our strategy team was in charge of digital marketing for Chick-fil-A. And Mike Leahy said, we should talk about the lifetime customer experience. So it really formed a different way of thinking about it, which is we kind of say tongue-in-cheek, we want you to have a relationship with the Harvard Business School Christian Fellowship from the time you're admitted to HBS until the time you're admitted to heaven. So you can never get away from us. The second thing was we thought we ought to organize around that. So we made the board over both the on-campus work and the alumni work. And thirdly, we said, we think there's enough interest here that we should hire somebody full-time. So we did a little fundraising. A number of you have participated in that. And gratefully, we hired Ryan Yee, who many of you know. And it just, there he is. Ryan, back here. Thank you very much. He really kick-started it. And, numbers don't tell the whole story, but this is HBS, so we ought to give a couple of numbers. So what's happened now is that, get this, so there are over 200 people on the email list. It's averaged about 220 just in the business school for the last few years. There are 50 to 60 people in Bible studies. There are 15 to 20 people generally on the leadership team, so that's this broad-based leadership. Ryan said that it's the third most active club on the HBS campus. So when you think about that and the momentum that is built there, we're just so incredibly grateful. And it shows up in amazing leaders like Maggie and Trey, right? And you only have to spend 2 minutes with them to just realize, what great people they are and what great leadership they brought. So now that we have that piece kind of blossoming, honestly, we want to figure out what to do with the alumni, because we know that's an important yearning. And Danelle joined us board a few years ago and has just been an absolute delight. And from the interview process, I think you said, well, your passion is about the alumni and how do we reach the alumni. So this is very much a work in process now. We're inviting you into a kind of a sausage-making process in the middle of developing a strategy. We thought Danelle should come up and just share with you a little bit about kind of where things are. So, Danelle?